Hello, everyone. Hopefully you can see and hear us all. So welcome to our Reach Sports Network Careers Open Day. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is John Birchall. I'm the Audience and Content Director for Sport at Reach, overseeing our digital brands across the country. We'll do proper introductions shortly, but I'd just like to thank our panellists who are joining us this evening. We've got Darren Lewis, who's Assistant Editor at The Mirror, Alice McKeegan, who's Head of Football for Manchester Evening News, Casey Fans, who's Digital Development Editor for Sport in Wales, and Darren Wells, who's our Sport Writer for Mirror Online. So each of the panellists will be talking about their own careers and experiences in the industry. And we've had absolutely loads of questions that have been submitted, so we'll be talking to them as well. Hopefully you can see the chat box on the side of the screen as well, so please do pop questions into there. But before we kind of properly start and kick off, I just wanted to explain kind of why it is that we're doing this. So as I'm sure plenty of you know, we're currently hiring for 8 new roles across our national titles at Reach, ranging across writing, editing, social media, production. And I've received plenty of questions in my emails, DMs, all sorts of people wanting to know whether the industry is right for them, what it is that can help people stand out for those who are applying, and whether they have the right qualifications, so on and so forth. So we thought it would be a really good opportunity to kind of open the doors to Reach and sports media careers more generally. I think it's also true that sports media has been quite an intimidating place from the outside looking in over the years. It's obviously a very competitive area, still lacks proper diversity across genders, ethnic diversity, LGBT plus people and people with disabilities. So what we don't want to happen is for that to become a vicious circle and people not seeing kind of advocates from their own communities and their own experiences in newsrooms and on sportscasts. So we wanted to kind of welcome a few of my colleagues to kind of talk about their experiences, their careers. So hopefully you'll get a real insight into what it's like working at Reach and working in sports media more generally. So I'm now going to shut up and ask all our panelists to give a brief run through of their careers, their job now, and their experience working in sports media. So I'm going to have to put surnames on the Darrens because we've got to. So Darren Lewis, would you be happy to start?
Yeah, no problem at all. Hi, I'm Darren Lewis. I'm Assistant Editor at the Daily Mirror. I've worked at the Mirror for 21 years. I was just trying to think about that. It's 21 years last month since I joined the company. And in that time, I've worked on sport for most of it. But I think my career's almost gone a little bit full circle in some respects, because I started out as a news journalist in local newspapers in the mid-90s. And that kind of gave me a really good insight, because the journalistic landscape has changed out of all recognition since then. You went out and you talked to people, no Twitter, and if people wanted to troll you, they sent you letters in green ink with little bits cut out of the newspapers stuck onto the letters, and you got it 3 days later rather than within a minute of your piece going up online. They were wonderful days, let me tell you. I think as far as my career path is concerned, working at local newspapers gave me a really good insight into building relationships, building trust, getting to a stage of understanding the machinations behind it. It's not just about what you write, and it's about people who work so hard behind the scenes to take what you've done from your screen, if you like, to the page. Sub-editors, editors, artists, lots of people behind the scenes that don't get the credit they deserve. And in some respects, it's important to bear in mind that, there are opportunities in those areas as well, rather than just there being an opportunity for you to be a writer. But from my point of view, I went from local newspapers to regional newspapers. I worked at the London Evening Standard for a short time, and then I joined Haters, which is still up and running, a sports agency run by a couple of wonderful guys called Jerry Cox and Nick Callow. And it was from haters that I moved to the Daily Mirror. And as I say, for most of that time at the Daily Mirror, I've been working on sport, traveling around Europe, traveling around the country, traveling around the world, actually, covering football in major competitions and whatnot. And now I've come back into news. I do a column at the front end of the paper, and I get involved in the kind of issues that are important as far as sport is concerned. I think we need to address the fact that for far too long, as you've been saying, John, journalism has been the sole preserve of one demographic, and that's needed to change, because we've seen a lot of stories over a long period of time that have affected parts of our readership, parts of radio stations listenership, TV station viewership, that are just not covered by the people that they purport to represent. And that has to change. The makeup of our industry has to change if we're going to continue, or if we are going to begin to address some of the holes in the reporting that exist at the moment. Far too many outlets believe that if you cover racism, then you are covering race. And they are completely misdirected in that regard. And things have only got a chance of changing if you've got Black, if you've got Asian, if you've got female, if you've got, gender representation. I think you need to understand the people that you are writing about, and to be part of that movement to change the makeup of the people writing the stories it's a really good time to be part of Reach, and the kind of thing that they're hoping to achieve by having a look at the workforce.
Definitely coming back. Alice, we'll come to you next, please.
Hi everyone, I'm Alice McKeegan and I'm the football editor of the Manchester Evening News. So like Darren, I'm from a news background, so I started, way back in 2007 now, as a trainee news reporter on my local paper, the Rochdale Observer. I was really proud to get that job because Rochdale as a place has had a bit of a kick in the nationals over the years, some nationals anyway. So I really wanted to work for my local paper to change the way that the place is viewed. And I absolutely loved that job. I was sent to court. I was sent cover the most amazing health stories, just a bit of everything really, to be honest. And it was a fantastic place for me to do my training qualifications. I qualified 18 months later, and I always knew I wanted to move on to a regional, where better than the Manchester Evening News for that. So I joined the Manchester Evening News as a news reporter covering Manchester Airport, which was a fascinating place to report on. Had a little office down there, used to go down the M60 every day, and basically I was left to my own devices. I had to come up with a news list every day, and that's really daunting as a 23-year-old I was at the time. But it kind of made you more determined to succeed, because if you were ringing the news desk every day without any stories, they'd send you to who knows where doing stories that you may not want to do. So you want to take ownership of that. So every day I would pride myself in producing a strong news list. So you had to form contacts, you had to talk to people, you had to ring the local police officers back when you were allowed to do that kind of thing. And you used to ring the airport press office, etc., etc. And you'd cover a bit of everything. And that's where I got my first taste of covering sport. If teams were flying in or out, I'd be sent to doorstep them as they came in. So I remember David Beckham flying in with AC Milan, and I'd just have to go and stand there and hope that he'd say hello or a quick word or wave, even anything. So I did that for a couple of years, and then I moved to covering the health beat, which I loved, for the MEN. And then I moved on to the news desk, which was a natural progression for me. It was a step up, a chance to go into management, junior management, managing the reporters. And that was challenging, because I went from sitting next to my colleagues to having to manage them, some of whom were, twice as experienced, twice as old as I was at the time. But again, it was something that I really wanted to do and loved it. But my passion was always in sport, despite enjoying news. It was something that I was really keen to pursue. And I managed to negotiate or convince someone somewhere along the line that I would do a day a week on sport whilst on the news desk, but sports writing. So I get the chance to cover mainly football, United and City. I got to know the sports desk a little bit along the way. And then when a vacancy came up for the football editor's job, probably about a couple of years later, so this was fast forward to April 2016, I just went and knocked on the editor's door and said, that's my dream job. Please, can you give me a go? And fortunately for me, he did. Gave me a 3-month trial, and I think about 4 or 5 weeks into that, he called me back in and said, the job's yours if you want it. And I've not looked back to really covering United and City, managing a brilliant team of football writers at the MEN. It's dream job territory, really. And every day I'm lucky to do it and enjoy what I do. And we cover 2 of the biggest and best clubs in the world with the global fan base. So yeah, that's in short my career so far.
Brilliant. Thanks, Alice. Go to Katie next, please.
Hi, so I'm Katie Sands, and I'm the digital development editor at Wales Online on Sport. Like Darren and Alice, I also started out working in news. So I got a job as a trainee news journalist back in 2015 at Wales Online, based in Cardiff, after I'd studied my postgrad at Cardiff Journalism School. So I studied English literature as my undergrad, even though I'd always known I'd wanted to be a journalist. Probably seriously from about GCSE level, I was advised to do a degree in something I just really enjoyed and then do a postgrad after that. So that was always my plan, really. My Easter placement during my postgrad was with Wales Online, and looking back, it was probably a bit of a trial run, really, because I got offered a job shortly after that. As a trainee, I covered what you'd expect, really, everything from court cases, council meetings, protests, community events, to human interest features. Being from Merthyr and living in Cardiff helped, because I had a bit of local knowledge, so you'd always bring in some stories from where you lived or where your family lived. I really enjoyed covering Merthyr for my local paper as well, the Merthyr Express, which I thought was really valuable for me. Not really 100% knowing what you'd be doing every day was exciting on news, and I really loved my time on news. And it was also, feel very privileged to be trusted to go and cover big events. I particularly enjoyed covering election results, and then I believe I interviewed Busted 1 week, followed by then First Minister Carwyn Jones the following week. So it can be very exciting and unpredictable, and I think you do need to be versatile if you do go into news first. And then just before I did my senior exams, then I did a lot of work on our 50th anniversary coverage of the Aberfan disaster, which I felt very, very privileged to do, as I grew up not far from that. I then worked on the news desk for a little bit, probably about a year or so, and then really enjoyed, kind of working on the other side of it then, before a reader got to see work published by others. And then, I switched to sport then full-time 2 years ago. So I'd had a secondment from news to sport for 3 months before that, which was very beneficial. And a colleague of mine who used to work in sports, Sean, was extremely supportive in pushing me into believing I could do it, because I think that was probably one of the attracting things, really, was kind of the unknown and can I really do it? Because I'd never actually wanted to work on sport before I joined Wales Online. After spending just some time in the newsroom, particularly around Wales rugby international matches, I just thought it looked like a lot of fun. So I just wanted to give it a go, really, and that's where that all stemmed from. Nowadays, I don't think I would have a very stereotypical sport role. I think people may think, you just write match reports and player ratings and things like that. But I can go from anything from writing SEO pieces to live blogging matches, or writing in-depth features. So I think it's important to remember you can kind of, within reason anyway, make a role what you want of it. It's not set in stone what a sport role has to be. And then one of my highlights working on sport is working on the Rugby World Cup in Japan in 2019. I was based in the office, but that was a lot of fun, especially with the time difference, working midnight to 8 a.m. shifts. So that was good. And I'm the only woman working on sport in Wales at the moment. Hopefully that's something that I won't feel the need to highlight in future, but it's part of the reason why I'm very passionate about shining a light on women in sport, both, you know, career-wise and also athlete-wise in terms of our coverage. So yeah, I'd say probably a bit biased, but I found having some news experience was really helpful when I made the move to sport. You know, having a new sense of what's a story and what is not a story. Yeah, I found it really helpful.
That's brilliant. Cheers, Katie. We've actually got a few questions that have come in around the kind of the jump from news to sport, which we may come back to in a bit. Last but not least, we've got Darren Wells, who works on Mirror Sport. So Darren, if you could talk to your career as well, please.
Hi everyone, my name's Darren Wells. I'm a sports writer for the Mirror. I've taken a bit of an unorthodox route into journalism, and very much at the start of my journey, if you like. I started working at the Mirror about 5 years ago, and actually on a 6-month fixed-term contract, doing as a float secretary. I had no journalism experience, no qualifications. I'd been to uni and studied sport, but it wasn't related to journalism anyway, but I knew I had an interest in that area. And I thought that by getting a job as a float secretary from my admin background would give me a chance to get a job doing something I would enjoy. 2 months into the fixed term contract, the sports secretary went on maternity leave. So I took up her role for a year. And it was while I was doing that I noticed the guys who work on sport and the writing. And I thought, well, how can I do what they're doing? It was around then that I approached the guys on the desk and asked if I could come and sit with them when I wasn't working and volunteer on the desk just to learn it, get a feel for it and see how that went. And then when I was volunteering, eventually they said, well, we've got some shifts going. You want to take up these shifts on the desk? So I was moonlighting 2 jobs at the same time. And then the maternity leave was coming to an end. And unfortunately, no full-time jobs were available. So I took up another job at the Mirror as office manager. And it was while I was doing that that the company said, we've got an NCTJ qualification available if you want to do it alongside your work. And then I was taking every shift under the sun that they would give me, evenings, weekends. You know, I'd finish my normal job at 5:30, start on the sport desk at 6 till anywhere between 10 and 12 o'clock at night. And then eventually, when I was doing the NCTJ course, a full-time role became available, which I applied for and I eventually got. And then it's been, since I've been doing that I've finished the course. And now I'm really just starting to get into kind of my everyday role as a sports journalist. And it's been really enjoyable so far. And hopefully the things that Katie and Darren talk about going to Europe and, you know, the Rugby World Cup are still to come for me.
Brilliant. Cheers, Darren. So hopefully everyone watching will be able to kind of see from the panelists speaking that, you know, there are lots of varied ways of getting into sports journalism. There isn't quite one track. So like I said, we've had loads of questions come in, and I can see plenty coming in down the side now. So thank you for that. And please do keep popping them into the chat function on YouTube. But like I said, we had loads of questions coming over the last week from all sorts of people, some who work in the industry already, some who have kind of thought about it, but have been sat on the fence. So just to kind of cover a little bit more about the jump from news to sport, because I never actually worked in news. I've only ever worked in sport, so it's of interest to me as well. But if I start with you, Alice, I've had a question here. Kind of, how did you find crossing over from news to sport? But I suppose more importantly, what are the things that you've taken from news that you still kind of use today in your day-to-day job on sport, and how did you find that transition?
Yeah, I think if you're a good news journalist, you'll become a good sports journalist. The basics are all the same. Can you write clean, accurate copy? Can you make contacts? Can you talk to people? And I think that's the main thing that I learned on news. It's about going out there, making contact, getting people to trust you, to know that if they speak to you, that you'll represent their story in a faithful and honest way. And I found that when I went on to sport, there were some journalists on sport that had covered news before, but probably nobody there really that had covered news to the level that I had. And I think it gives you an instant advantage, to be honest, because you're already aware of how you deal with a story, and it's perhaps how you deal with a story in a different way to how someone who's covered sport purely all of their career would. I think you're constantly thinking about follow-ups. You're constantly thinking about, is it legally sound, etc. I think there's no, as we've touched on earlier, there's no one way of getting into sports journalism. So I don't think it's absolutely vital that you start in news. But what I'd say to anyone, if there's anyone watching this that's training in news, then definitely the skills that you learn there, you can easily transfer to sport. And I found that because I was obviously on the MEN already, I knew a lot of the team, and that made it easier in terms of moving over. But I would say that if there is anyone already in a newsroom watching this and that would like to go and spend some time on the sports desk, just speak to the desk, speak to the sports desk, see, can you perhaps write a couple of pieces for them, perhaps an opinion piece, just try it out, see whether it's something that you'd like to do long term. And don't be afraid to do it. There's no right or wrong way of doing it. It's just about trial and error as much as anything, and lean on the people around you for that experience. I'm not a press box going reporter. That wasn't me, because I joined sport really as an editor level. So that's more about managing people and editing their copy, etc. So I don't think that stops you becoming an editor. And as someone alluded to earlier, sport's a lot more than just going to matches. There are social media roles, editing roles, etc., etc. So yeah, just try it out, and I'm sure there's a role for everyone.
That's brilliant. And Darren, you mentioned that you started your career working on news. Is there anything that you kind of learned from the early years working as a news reporter that you still kind of rely on and fall back on today in your current role?
Yeah, I think there's no substitute for talking to people. There's no substitute for picking up the phone or going out there. I think both the ladies mentioned it earlier, and it's so true that in our digital age, sometimes people think that all we do is sit in front of a laptop. But you've got to talk to people. You've got to get out there. You've got to build trust. You've got to build relationships. Because when you do that, then when somebody does have a story, they know that they want to tell it to you. And as Alice was saying earlier, they know that you'll represent them fairly, accurately, that you will be able to empathize with them. Because sometimes, some of the best stories about football aren't about what goes on the pitch. Often they're about what goes on off the pitch. And so that and we're seeing that now in any number of areas. So working and having a bit of a news background, you get a sense for where you want to look, what angle you want to take. And also working in a news background, it teaches you to be proactive. You don't wait for a story to fall on your lap. You kind of think about an angle beforehand. You look at the big picture and you decide what angle you want to take, and you pursue that angle. And I think you learn a lot from the lack of resources that you have, particularly when you work in local newspapers, because they don't have a lot of money. It isn't as glamorous as people might think it is. And what that teaches you to do is to make your own luck in some respects. It teaches you also you're not working within set defined hours. It's not a 9-to-5 job. No journalist will ever tell you it's a 9-to-5 job. Your social life goes out the window, but that's okay, because you're doing something that you love. And in order to get to the story, you stay until you get that story. So there are lots of different things that you can learn from having a news background as you make that move into sport. And I have to add that when I did make that move into sport, there were lots of people in sport that made me a better reporter with their attitude to stories, the way that the creative ways that they were able to express themselves when, we're all watching one game, but you read some of my colleagues or my paper and other papers and you see the forensic way that they look at it. You see the different angles that they take, and you learn so much from the people around you. And I don't think you ever stop learning, but certainly when you come into it from a news background or from a non-sporting background, as Darren was saying a second ago, there is a clarity about the way you see it. Everybody might see it one way because they've been doing it for so long, and you can come in and see, wonder what all the fuss is about. So that is, I suppose, the beauty of the cross-section of people that you've got here, is that we all come with different perspectives at the same thing, of the same thing. But certainly when you come, I can only talk about a news perspective, when you come from that, you do bring some things that you learn from some people who go about their business very well indeed.
Cheers, Darren. So just a bit of a different one. We've got a question here from someone who says, what would you recommend to a 15, 16-year-old trying to get into sports media and journalism now? And how do you think that has changed over time? So, obviously the media landscape has changed an awful lot, even in the last 3-5 years. So it's kind of difficult to know exactly what things will look like in the next 5-10 years as new people enter the industry. But Darren Wells, what are the kind of things that you think you see as important then, important now, and if you're a youngster trying to get into the industry, what are the key things that you'd be focusing on and trying to learn to make you a better journalist?
I think the thing that helped me the most was once I got on the sport desk and was doing regular shifts, that practice of doing it, the repetitive practice, made me improve quickly. So for anyone out there who is looking to get into it, I would say put yourself out there, get as much experience as you can. And even if that's something as simple as setting up a blog at home, getting the practice in, because even writing a blog and sending it to 5 people that that might be a big thing. And then the next time send it to 10 people, and eventually you can build up your confidence. You can get used to writing or whatever it is you want to do regularly. And I think if you push for opportunities when you see them, that eventually will pay off.
Brilliant, nice one. So kind of similarly, Katie, as Darren said, kind of practice makes perfect with these things. But obviously, you as an editor, you will also get copy across your desk and work with journalists on their stories. What are the things that, as an editor and someone who will commission stories, what is it that you're really looking for, especially from someone who may be new to the team or new to writing about sport? What are the things within stories or within content that you see as really important, and what do you kind of prioritize as an editor?
Well, if it's kind of at the pitch stage, I think it's a good idea to have an idea beforehand of what the piece is actually going to be, rather than maybe have a couple of elements and then you may get confused over what you may expect it to be one thing at the end, but the writer might do something differently. I think having clarity on what the piece you want to write is important. And then I suppose it depends on the piece, really. I mean, if it's a feature, if it's a broad feature, you want to be speaking either to one person really in depth and like going beyond the surface level, opinions, whether it's on a match or a career or your new club or something. I want to be reading and thinking as a reader, really. I don't want to just be reading things that I would probably expect to see, in a press release, perhaps. I want to be reading more in-depth things than that. But yeah, if clean, accurate copy, that people are going to be happy with, the people who are in it are going to be happy with when they see it. That's a confidence to have. But yeah, just an interesting story that you're passionate about telling. Really, I think it's very obvious and very clear when people are passionate about what they're writing about, it does really come across to editors and readers as well.
No, that's great. Cheers, Katie. I think, obviously I mentioned that things have changed a lot in the last 5-10 years. And I think one of the big things is that there's no such thing really anymore as someone who is only a reporter. You know, they're across social media, they'll be working across broadcast, written work, and Darren Lewis, obviously something that you've done an awful lot of is kind of transferring your skills as a writer onto TV, radio. So how did you transfer those skills that you've got into different formats? And do you have a preference in terms of how you go about it, or is it all the same to you in terms of telling good stories?
Do I have a preference? You're going to get me in trouble. I'm trying to keep my job. I always did love broadcasting. I always have loved it, and I've been very fortunate to have some very kind people allow me to get on screen, allow me to get behind the microphone. As far as the Mirror is concerned, my bosses in around about 2007-8 came up with an idea for a transfer show where we would talk about football transfers every day. As a one-stop shop, if you like, we would go through the papers. So it'd be a football transfer show meets a paper review. And we would call it Football Spy. We did it from the very first show was actually in my living room. But eventually we did so many editions of it that we got sponsorship, and we also that sponsorship enabled us to go and cover events abroad. We went to a World Cup on the back of one, and every day I did it, I was learning to do that job. I was learning to broadcast. I was learning to be confident behind the microphone or in front of the camera. And I think every day you do your job, you're training to be better at your job. And I think whether that is broadcasting, writing, in production, whatever. And I really enjoyed doing that. I still do enjoy broadcasting. Listen, it's no secret that I have a few opinions of my own, and I like to express those opinions. And I think we talk about the landscape changing. It isn't just changing in terms of digital rising as a medium, but it's also changed in terms of younger journalists not being afraid to speak their truth, not being afraid to challenge the established order, the established conventions, the kind of thing that maybe past generations would be afraid to confront. The current generation of journalists are not afraid to confront those things. And so from my opinion, having my point of view, I've always had an opinion. It's no secret that I have a very big concern about the representation of young black men, not just in sport, but in society as a whole. And being able to broadcast has allowed me to be able to articulate those concerns that I have. And from my point of view, it's important to be able to do so. So how did I get into it? I got into it by taking the opportunity that was afforded to me to build something very small, but now obviously Reach, the Daily Mirror, gives me a platform to be able to develop those views and in some way have a voice at a time when having a voice is very important indeed.
Absolutely. Cheers, Darren. And that actually goes perfectly into the next question, which was how do we improve the diversity of sports journalists within sports media and the content that we provide to our audience. So Alice, we'll start with you on that one, please, in terms of how does diversity form part of your thinking every day, both in terms of your team, but also, you know, the content that we produce in a responsible way?
I think in terms of the team, there is still work to go, to be honest, in sports journalism, because although things are getting better, and they've certainly got better in the last 5 years since I've broken into the industry, I still think there aren't enough women in football journalism, being frank. You know, I think there's some fantastic women that work in sport and in journalism, but I still think there needs to be more. And I think that starts from trainee level up. I've been involved in recruitment for a number of roles for the MEN, and we still don't get that many female applicants, and I'm not sure why, to be honest. I don't know whether it's an issue, people not having the confidence to go for it, or thinking that they wouldn't be taken seriously. That's absolutely not the case. We've had a couple of brilliant female sports writers on the MEN in the past few years, and there's absolutely no difference between being a woman or being a man in sports journalism. If you're good at your job, you're good at your job. So I still think there is a little bit more to go to get teams a bit more diverse, and that also goes for black writers as well. We need to do more to attract people, and it's also in terms of backgrounds. A lot of people would still view sports journalism as a white male middle class occupation. I'm from Rochdale. I went to a comprehensive school. I'm female. Hopefully I don't fit that stereotype at all. And there are lots of others like me. There's men on my team that don't fit that background either in each of those categories. So, but that's something that as hiring managers, I think we can still do more in terms of when we are recruiting for the future. In terms of the content that we produce, I think what we always need to have in mind is that we should be representing our readers and writing about issues that matter to them, and that's the most important thing, really. Football's all about fans. We shouldn't be writing things that we think would exclude certain groups. We need to be inclusive. And as I said earlier, for Manchester United and Manchester City, that it's not just local fans, albeit they're incredibly important. There are match goers that come normally from around the world, and there are supporters from every single continent. We look at where our stories are read. It's everywhere. So covering stories that matter to people is what it's all about, really. And every day, whenever I commission a story, you've got to think: is this fair? Is it accurate? Is it balanced? Is it representing our readers? Is it representing the fans? Is it representing the stories that matter to people? Because ultimately, it's all about the people that read our work.
No, that's brilliant. Cheers. Katie, just come to you, because you mentioned how there was a woman on the sports desk in Wales and how important that was for you to kind of, see that it was doable and see that it was something that you could work in. So how important was that in terms of, I suppose, why was it that you felt, the sport wasn't necessarily for you until you kind of saw that person who kind of opened your eyes to sport and the possibilities there?
So my she worked on sport, and then she actually crossed back over to news. Sian, she was a production journalist. She was probably giving me more confidence that I could actually go and work on sport and it would be fine, and I wouldn't get sacked for being not very good. Much more than I was giving myself that confidence. I'm not quite sure why that was, but it was really, really invaluably helpful, really, having her there. She was very supportive, even when I would just say, oh, I'm interested in it. What's it like? Do you think I could maybe do a shift or come in and shadow maybe when there's a rugby match or something? I think it's really, really important to have those people that you can go to and kind of sound off them, I suppose, and I think as soon as you say something, I think it's kind of out there. Then you don't have to quite worry about it so much. So that was very helpful. And then being the only woman there now, I don't want to conflate the issues, really, because just because you're a woman working in sport doesn't mean you necessarily have to cover women's sport or vice versa, really. I mean, we've got very talented women reporters across Reach covering Championship and Premier League clubs, so that there's no automatic assumption that just because you're a woman you're going to have to cover women's sport. That's your automatic patch. But I do think having a more diverse workforce opens your eyes as a newsroom and as a department to broader stories than you would notice or see or think were important than if you had what is deemed the traditional demographic of sports journalists, really. So I think having a diverse, the more diverse you are, I think the more diverse your stories are going to be naturally.
That's great, Katie. Darren, Lewis, just to come back to you on this, 'cause it's obviously something that you've spoken about an awful lot, but I kind of wanted to get your thoughts in terms of how we, as mainstream media, the part that we have to play in terms of improving the level of discourse. Over the last 12 months, there's been a huge amount of conversation around this, but how important it is that for us to actually have a say and be vocal on these issues, we as us ourselves as newsrooms have to be diverse and have to have people who can talk to these issues. How important do you think that is?
Yeah, we can say all the right things and we can have all the right sympathies, but there's no substitute for having Black and Asian, Black and brown people covering issues that they can relate to, in the same way that I wouldn't dream of trying to suggest that I could cover an issue relating to a woman better than Alice or Katie. I know that if I read something that is written by somebody who looks like me, then there is a greater degree of empathy that that person can have with me. And I think that the last 12 months have shown us right across the media landscape that the representation in relation to Black and brown people is poor. And we continually see that when Black and brown people ask to be treated equally, it's a debate rather than a human right. And it should never be that way. So that will only change once our media is more representative. It will only change when we have people making decisions about what goes into our newspapers, onto our radio stations, onto our TVs, who are Black. I think until not very long ago, I would say the last 6 months, you could watch the output of a TV station all day and see probably maybe two, maybe just one Black presenter. The landscape is pitiful, if I'm honest. And I think a lot of the young people watching that will know that already. So I'm not telling them anything that they don't already know. But there are some stark, sobering statistics for us to look at if we want to be realistic about addressing the problems that our media landscape faces at the moment. And they are not going to be solved by being nice to people, saying nice words, sympathizing, trying to empathize, meaning well, getting a few people in at ground level. They're going to be changed by getting people in at a high level, using their expertise. And they're out there. They're out there. So it's not a question of saying we've got to train somebody up or whatever. They're out there. They have the expertise. They have the knowledge. But it's a closed shop at the moment. And so there is so little opportunity for them to get to a level where they can be involved in the decision-making process. But if we want it to change, then the picture has to change. And the picture's not going to be changed by us saying nice things.
If I can stay with that, it's really interesting. It's a great point in terms of we're doing this perfectly well-meaning event here, and we're trying to encourage people. But obviously, Darren, you have experience of talking to young Black, Asian wannabe journalists. What do you see as the kind of impediment? Is it a lack of representation when they open their newspaper and see who's writing bylines? Is it a lack of representation on TV? What is it that you're hearing when you speak to young journalists from these communities?
There is I think there is a will. Well, I know there is a will. I know that there are young Black and Asian journalists who are going out, getting the qualifications, getting the experience. They only really get listened to when something tragic happens. It took a man to die last year for lots of TV and radio stations and even newspapers to say, you know what, goodness me, we don't have enough Black people here. It took a man to die for that to happen. And when that did happen, there were occasions where some outlets who had people walking through their newsrooms and they were doing all the thing of showing them around, and then suddenly they went, oh my goodness, where are we going to find somebody who, where are we going to find the talent? And the talent has been there, but to be frank, all too often they've been paying lip service to it. And so is the talent still there? Of course it's there. But what happens now, and what has happened in a lot of cases, that people have decided to build their own platforms. They've moved away from mainstream broadcast and TV and radio. In some cases, they decide that they don't want to move into newspapers because from their point of view, they still feel that newspapers don't adequately reflect them. That's the work that we've got to do. We have to do that work. We can mean well all we want, but when we see some of the issues that have come up over the last 3 months and the perspectives that are taken, they don't reflect young black men and women out in the wider world. So it is a multi-layered issue to address, and it won't simply be, I keep saying it, it's not going to be addressed by us meaning well. It's going to be addressed by us actually investing in the talent, not just listen, all too often people think addressing diversity is getting a few people in at ground level, changing the look. But are those people involved in the important discussions? Are they empowered? Are they given the opportunity to change the way things are done? And by changing the way things are done, I don't just mean allowing them to be around the fire, if you like. I mean, listening to what they've got to say and acting on what they've got to say. And if you look at our media, I keep talking about the media landscape at the moment. Has it changed? I mean, we can all answer that for ourselves individually. You don't need me to tell you. But if we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of it, there are some really uncomfortable things about our media landscape that we have to change if we're going to address the inequalities that we see at the moment.
Absolutely, that's brilliant. Thank you, Darren. So just on that, we obviously, one of the reasons that we're so keen to do this is to kind of make people who've been unsure about a role in the mainstream media. Obviously, we ourselves have seen the kind of proliferation of fan channels and, kind of independent publishers and websites and social media channels kind of really changing things for us. So it's become a more competitive field in that sense. People can start to blog and, take it viral and do fantastic things. And it's something that we obviously have to think about. So for a young journalist now, or young wannabe journalist, or someone who just is interested in sports media, what is it that you think that they can do to stand out from the crowd? So Darren Wells, I'll start with you on that one, please.
It's definitely very, very difficult to stand out, but I think following your passion is definitely a big thing. Like Darren said, he's well placed to talk about certain issues because he's in it, he's seen it. So doing that, I think, puts you in a much better position to write about it in a great way.
And same question to you, Alice, really, in terms of, obviously you've hired for a number of roles now. What is it when you're, looking into the market to see who's out there? What are the things that really stand out to you from a young journalist?
Something different, to be honest, and probably think, what does that mean? I always remember I carried out an interview a few years ago now, and it was for a trainee, sort of a junior writer role, someone who was qualified but didn't have that much experience. And I remember being blown away in interview by the successful candidate because he came with a fully formed idea that was different to anything that I'd heard of before. It was a Manchester United idea, and he had a look at the players that Manchester United were likely to sign that summer. And one of them was pretty much nailed on, and he tracked down his first ever coach, overseas, and managed to persuade this chap who hadn't spoken before to speak to him. Got pictures, the full package basically, and it was a wonderful human interest story about this player, kind of the inside story of their journey from a small village to being a potential Manchester United player. And the successful candidate, the young journalist, just came into the interview and said, well, if you gave me this job, this is what I could produce. This is the standard of peace. And I just thought that's the dedication that's required. Sometimes, you're looking for something, like you say, just to stand out. Just if you've got 400 people applying for a role, what's the one thing that you can do to grab someone's attention? Because, you might only have a minute to kind of shine, and that might be just something that is ready to go, an idea. And for me, it's all about people. So a human interest story. That incident really made me think. I just went, wow, and he got the job.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Alice. So we've only got a little bit of time left, and I realise that people have been dropping questions into the chat here. So I've just picked out a couple to kind of to put to the room. So first of all, from Pete Layden, coverage of women's sport and disability sport in mainstream media is very poor, to say the least. What responsibilities do you think sports desks have to change this? So, Katie, this is obviously something that we've had conversations about recently. Women's sport is obviously something that you're very passionate about telling stories around. So, both from a kind of what responsibility do you think we have to do so, but also what do you think the potential is in terms of telling these stories and producing great content off the back of it?
Yeah, I think in terms of potential, women's sport and also disability sport, as Pete says, it is representation in the mainstream media is poor historically, and I think only recently we've started to see that change. Particularly, I'm talking about women's sport there. But I think in terms of potential, you've got this huge arena of stories that largely is untapped, because it's only recently that people are kind of waking up and realizing that some of these players and athletes have got amazing stories to tell. So I think in terms of potential, I think there's definitely lots of potential there, really, to tell really good stories, and not just about sport as well. I think it's important to kind of remember that sport isn't necessarily just about what goes on the field or the pitch or the training ground. It's about the person, and you can almost tell a story of a community really through sport sometimes. So I think it's important to remember it can be really, sport can almost be just the introduction to a story. It doesn't have to be the whole thing. In terms of responsibility, I think sports desks and mainstream media in general in the UK do have a responsibility to report on not just men's elite sport, but I think there's obviously other kind of factors at play there. What your commercial situation is with a broadcaster or radio station or newspaper. If lots more people will be interested in perhaps the Premier League men's side than they would in the women's side, because they've had a very, very long legacy of loyal, supportive fans. So I think it's important to have that shift in your priorities in what you cover, definitely.
Brilliant. Cheers, Katie. So there's a question here in terms of pitching story ideas. So what is the best practice for a freelancer pitching a story idea? For example, I have an MBA article I'm working on. What should be my biggest considerations around getting an article published? So Darren Wells, we'll go to you on that one, please.
So I think you need to think about who your article's for, what it is you want to tell, what is your point of view that you want to get across, and then who that would suit best. If it's MBA, look for relevant publishers who do that sort of thing frequently, and then see whether there's anything that you could get feedback on and add to it that would make them more interested.
Brilliant. Cheers, Darren. And Darren Lewis, in terms of commissioning, what are the ideas, or what is it when someone comes to you and says, I really want to write about, or I really want to talk about X? What is it that you're really looking for when that happens?
I'm looking for something that I haven't thought about before, to be honest with you, because as we all know, this is a very crowded space, and we see lots of different variations on various issues. So when somebody comes up that seemed so obvious, but you hadn't considered it straight away, I think Alice said it earlier on, if it's something that you look at and you think, well, I would want to read that, rather than your first instinct being, I've read that before in a different guise by somebody who may well have done it better, then obviously that's something that I'd certainly be alert to and alive to. I think that there are so many people at the moment, I see so much in terms of original thinking, fresh ideas, and something that gets me wondering, gosh, why didn't I think of that? That is very much up my street.
Cheers, Darren. And so I'm going to have this as the last question from Jack Baker, but I'll come to you all if that's okay. So what advice would you give to someone with no experience, but a real passion and belief that they could bring something unique to a role? So Alice, you've been doing a fair bit of recruitment over the last year or so. What would you say to someone who, like you said, doesn't have that level of experience or necessarily the qualifications, but really cares about it and thinks that they could add something? What would you say to them?
I'd encourage them to get in touch with their local sports desk if they want to go into sports. Drop them an email. It might be that you're not offered the position of chief football writer straight away, but if you show enthusiasm and a willingness to learn, then that's really attractive to any sports desk. It might be that there are some shifts available potentially, or it might just be that if it's a younger writer that might be thinking about applying for a course potentially, you might be able to just give them some advice. They might be able to email over a piece that they'd written. You could perhaps give them some feedback, some areas where they could improve. And also, I don't think it's mentioned yet, but work experience. It's a fantastic way to test out whether it's an industry, it's a career that you want to go in longer term. I did my first work placement when I was 16 at the BBC, absolutely loved it and knew that's the area that I wanted to go into in the future. So if you're able to do that while studying, if you do decide to go down that route, or even while you're still at school, then definitely do so. And just if you're lucky enough to get a placement, be enthusiastic. If you're making the tea, make the tea, but then have a chat with one of the sports desks while you're in the kitchen and just soak up any advice that they've got to offer you. And if you show great attitude, great ideas, then you'll go a really long way in this industry. And you just need someone to take a chance on you. And that's what happened with me.
That's brilliant. Cheers, Alice. Darren, well, same question to you. What advice would you give to someone who's passionate and looking for that kind of first foot in the door?
So I would say get as much experience as you can, as much varied experience. Push yourself, really go for it and have the confidence that you can achieve it. Persevere, and eventually you'll get where you want to get to. Speak to people who work in the industry, get as much feedback as possible, and just every day keep trying to learn and improve.
Brilliant. Cheers, Darren. Katie, anything to add?
I would just add that if you're maybe struggling to get a bit of work experience, I know it's really hard nowadays where people larger outlets anyway may only take people on work experience if they've already got experience somewhere else. I would say maybe get in touch with your local football club or rugby club or whatever sport it may be and ask them, if they could maybe produce some content for the club, really, because that is a form of work experience in sport. So that could help in getting a foot in the door. I think don't be afraid to ask questions, because 99% of the time someone who works in sport is going to be very happy to give you their advice and their opinion on something. And the last thing I wanted to say was almost be a bit of a critic. Try and soak up as much media as you can. I remember being told when I was at university, read as much news as you can, because that's going to make you a better writer. I think don't be afraid to stoke up as much as you can, and then formulate your own opinion on it, and you can have a real think about what you would have done differently, or what you would like to focus in on if you were writing a story on a particular subject.
That's brilliant, Katie. And Darren, same question to you. Someone who might not have the experience, they might not have the qualifications, but really sees a future in this industry. What would you say to them? What advice would you give to them?
See every opportunity, seize on every opportunity that you get. Appreciate it if you get the opportunity to get some work experience, because I think a lot of people come across a lot of people who don't appreciate the value of what they have if they manage to secure an opportunity to get some work experience. Learn from the people that you're working with. Take every opportunity that you can. I got into football writing because the person who worked on my local newspaper, he couldn't attend some games, and there was an opportunity to step in, and so I did, and I've never really looked back. So take every opportunity you can. Don't say no to anything. Have a can-do attitude. Forget about a social life, because that will go out of the window, and just learn from the people who have been doing it for a long time before you begin to find your own way. But it really is a fantastic job, a fantastic industry, whether you're working news, sport, showbiz, whatever side of the industry you work in, television, radio. It's just a fantastic industry to be in. You'll work really hard, but you'll get a lot of satisfaction from it as well. But start local, see if you can get that work experience at your local newspaper, your local radio station. Write as often as you can, read as often as you can, maybe even model your style on somebody early on before you start to find your own way, as I said before. And just enjoy it. Just enjoy it. Sometimes you get so long or so far down the line that you forget to enjoy what you've done so far. So maybe every so often just take a look back and think, I've really done something. I remember my first ever match report. It was Barnet against Darlington at Underhill, the old Underhill, Barnet's old ground. And I got about 6 pars into the newspaper, and I thought I'd won the Pulitzer Prize, and I got home. It was the equivalent of a child taking home a drawing that they'd done at school and their mum putting it onto the fridge, But for me, it was everything, because it was the first time I'd ever been published in a newspaper, in a national newspaper. And I was delighted by that. And I really did see it as the fulfillment of taking an opportunity that I managed to get, because the first 2 years of me working at my local newspaper, I didn't get paid at all, but I wanted to do it because I loved it. And I think, take the opportunity. That is the biggest bit of advice I would give, because you never know where it's going to lead.
Oh, that's brilliant, Darren. Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone for spending their evening with us and offering their advice. And there's some fantastic stuff in there, and hopefully a lot for people who've been watching to take away and learn from. If you've got questions, we've had our shared Twitter handles and all that kind of thing, so please do get in touch. But just thank you again to both the Darrens, Alice and Katie for joining us, and thank you very much, and hopefully we'll see plenty of you applying for the roles in the near future. Cheers, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.